am I pronouncing your name right, Anna? Sorry. So, how many of you here have appeared, how many of you have your name appeared in the Washington Diplomat before? Anyone? Raise your hand. All right, we have work to do. Yeah? It should be a goal for everyone here. Anna is the managing editor of the Washington Diplomat. She's going to speak to us about future trends in cultural diplomacy. The Washington Diplomat is the flagship publication for the diplomatic community here in Washington, D.C. Anna is also a frequent columnist. She writes for the Diplomatic Pouch. She's a frequent writer and speaker on the subjects of world affairs, U.S. politics, foreign policy, national security, travel, arts and culture. I think all of the elements of cultural diplomacy. Mark, please join me in welcoming Anna Gawel.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you everyone for sticking around on this nice day. I'm honored to speak today at this event. You know, when our newspaper actually began about 25 years ago, our publisher had the foresight to include a dedicated culture section in addition to our regular news and political coverage. Even though back then, to be honest, culture was very much an afterthought, not only among the diplomatic community, but Washington in general. You know, after all, the city, despite having all of its Smithsonian museums, was for many years a relatively sleepy government town. Of course, thanks to our new president, neither our government nor our town can be described as sleepy anymore, but that's, you know, a whole other discussion. But as someone who's personally grown up in this area, I've seen how DC has evolved into an international cosmopolitan city, and how this evolution has really taken place side by side with the dramatic growth of cultural and public diplomacy. Obviously, the primary purpose of diplomats is still to cultivate ties with Congress and the administration and drum up trade and investment. But today, many embassies, both large and small, have public diplomacy officers or cultural attachés, and this soft power shift has become a fundamental part of an embassy's portfolio. And I have no doubt that this phenomenon will only grow stronger. So today I want to talk about the trends I've witnessed working with diplomats for over 17 years, not to age myself, and also offer some specific examples of cultural diplomacy in action, and how embassies use it creatively to get their messages across. I also want to touch on the importance of soft power in this age of heightened political tensions, and how cultural diplomacy has adapted to challenges such as budget constraints and social media, which have really changed our notions of, our traditional notions of cultural outreach. Some of this outreach continues to be basic but effective. Nations such as Armenia, Poland, and many others have held exhibits literally inside Congress, which is obviously a direct way to establish a soft power presence on the Hill. This is especially critical today given the large number of vacancies in the State Department and the turmoil in the White House. So access to decision makers in the US government for many diplomats is quite limited at the moment. So for example, the Japan Information and Culture Center, which is an extension of the embassy, recently invited congressional staffers to participate in a workshop on how to make traditional Japanese desserts. I always say there's no better way to strengthen ties with the congressional staffers who operate as gatekeepers than to feed them. That will always stay true in cultural diplomacy. But similarly, as part of a big meeting of the U.S. Conference on Mayors, which we write about in our upcoming March issue, the Canadian Embassy hosted a networking reception for dozens of American mayors, which is a great example of reaching out beyond the Beltway to the people who are actually making things happen on the ground in the face of gridlock at the federal level. And this gets to what I see as the most critical trend in cultural diplomacy, which is this effort for countries to go outside the proverbial beltway and give average Americans a better understanding and appreciation of other cultures. This type of outreach is especially vital given the inward anti-immigrant sentiment that not only helped propel President Trump to victory, but has also fueled populist forces across the Atlantic as well. On that note, one innovative development on this front is called Passport DC. It's now in its 10th year, and it's a month-long international showcase that attracts tens of thousands of visitors to dozens of DC institutions and embassies. The embassies, in fact, are probably the most popular feature of the event, the open houses, which let visitors enjoy food, arts, craft, and performances at roughly, as of last count, about 70 embassies. So many of these are from nations that Americans might not be familiar with, such as Azerbaijan, Brunei, Ethiopia, Ukraine. We've worked with the host, Cultural Tourism DC, since the beginning, and this is one of the more successful experiments in letting the public go behind closed doors and kind of discover one of the city's still hidden treasures. A similar venture is called Winter National at the Ronald Reagan Building, which you can read about in the issue that we've placed out here. And this annual showcase also features dozens of embassy booths that highlight things like the arts, crafts, and tourism. And we too ourselves have tried to raise public awareness of cultures that tend to fly below the radar with our Ambassador Insider series, in which we interview envoys from a range of countries such as EU, Iraq, Belize, and Kosovo. We talk not only about the latest political and economic developments, but also about tourism potential, American expat communities, educational opportunities, and other soft power initiatives. It's been interesting to me, though, that despite how popular cultural diplomacy has become, many Washingtonians still don't realize what they have in their own backyard. So I actually, excuse me, so one of the ongoing trends I see is a sustained effort among embassies just to get the public aware of what they offer on a regular basis. So this includes the city's cultural pioneers, such as Italy, France, Austria, Spain, which still maintain a very active roster of events. But it also goes beyond these mainstays to encompass a growing number of countries that have discovered the power of public outreach. For example, the Korean and Japanese embassies both have their own separate cultural arms. The embassies of Canada and Australia have both made a concerted effort in recent years to highlight the indigenous communities in their nations and pay respect to the injustices that these groups have endured. Another fascinating trend involves Latin America, a region that doesn't always get top billing in Washington, but compared to other hotspots at least, such as the Middle East, but one whose art scene has really exploded in recent years. For example, the Mexican Cultural Institute has become one of the top venues for Latin artists, musicians, filmmakers, and chefs, with many of the recent events praising the benefits of immigration, which obviously touches on the political side of cultural diplomacy, which I'll get to in just a bit. Washingtonians can also take tango lessons at the Embassy of Argentina, or see a comprehensive survey of 20th century Latin art at the OAS Art Museum of the Americas. In fact, the Art Museum of the Americas, AMA, has really ramped up the number of exhibitions it stages, which in turn helps promote the work of the OAS, a group that is frequently maligned by US lawmakers as a waste of taxpayer money. So just recently, the museum hosted a celebration of Black History Month in collaboration with the Center in Chicago. So not only does the AMA frequently collaborate with US institutions, these exhibits serve to highlight the OAS itself, which budget-wise is a relatively small organization. But for dozens of ambassadors, especially those from smaller nations who double up as envoys to both the US and to the OAS, highlighting the value of this aspect of their job is very key for them. So, also I found, obviously, cultural diplomacy is used in very specific, targeted ways. Some serve a business purpose. The Netherlands embassy last year transformed their ambassador's residence with over 10,000 tulips, It was obviously a very pretty display, but it also served a purpose, which is to show Americans that Holland is the world's second largest exporter of agricultural products, eclipsed only by the US. So showing lawmakers who were invited to the event the strong economic ties between the Netherlands and the US, is a very shrewd move in light of the fact that the White House wants to clamp down on free trade. So other events are more of a general showcase of the country's accomplishments. The gentleman mentioned sports, embassies of Poland, Sweden, they all have, I know nothing about sports, so bear with me, of their nationals and their hockey games. They have Sweden night, Polish night to kind of highlight their athletes. The Korean Cultural Center actually recently hosted a broadcast of the ladies half-pipe finals from the Pyeongchang Winter Olympics, which was a very smart way to let Americans experience the Olympics firsthand beyond the TV coverage that tends to focus solely on American athletes. Another example of using cultural diplomacy for a very specific purpose is Haiti, whose ambassador is actually on the cover of our upcoming March issue. Obviously, Haiti has been in the news recently, but not for the reasons it would like. But instead of retreating from President Trump's reported use of profanities in referring to Haiti and African countries, the ambassador has really confronted the issue head on. He recently urged Americans to visit his whole country during a fashion show at the embassy, and he's repeated the colorful language in our own newspaper, which is quite a first for us as a diplomatic newspaper. But on a more serious note, he really wants to show Americans that his country is much more nuanced than the basket case it's often portrayed as in the Western media. So to that end, he regularly hosts events at his renovated embassy, including a culinary tasting where he himself has prepared some of the dishes. So on that note, one of the most durable trends in cultural diplomacy, I think, is food. There's no better way to capture hearts and minds than through our stomachs. As part of Passport DC, for instance, the Embassy Chef Challenge has become a friendly competition within the diplomatic community and a point of pride for many embassies. DC Public Schools host International Food Days, where embassy partners such as Belgium offer students a taste of the foods that their kids eat in the cafeterias back home. Years ago, actually, the Embassy of Kazakhstan was clever enough to get on Andrew Zimmern's TV show, Bizarre Foods, which was a major coup on their part because it exposed their cuisine, including horse meat, to a nationwide US audience. On a more local level, the Peruvian embassy recently hosted a food truck developed by two Peruvian brothers as part of an effort not only to showcase the brothers' business venture, but to raise funds for earthquake relief back home. Peru also regularly spotlights its native pisco sour drink, and certainly using wine and liquor is always an effective way to get attention from thirsty, overworked Washingtonians. Georgia collaborated with the Smithsonian to explore the origins of wine civilization, and at the same time that promotes its own long history of winemaking. The Portuguese ambassador created an interesting event called Toast to America, which he holds at his residence on July 4th to promote the fact that America's founding fathers toasted with a glass of Portuguese Madeira wine after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So again, these are great examples of cross-cultural bridge building. I think what this boils down to is that so much of cultural diplomacy is about creativity. One of the biggest myths I've encountered is that people assume embassies have endless budgets. They don't. Budget constraints are a reality for most of us. And especially since the 2008 recession, I've noticed that the number of National Day receptions, particularly the lavish ones, have dwindled or become more understated. So that means that smaller embassies need to get creative to compete with their larger peers. Tiny Estonia may not have a lot of resources, but it's partnered with the National Gallery of Art to host a large exhibition on an Estonian Renaissance painter to commemorate the centennial of its independence. Likewise, the Swiss Embassy collaborated with the Phillips Collection on a major show on Swiss-born artist Paul Klee. The embassy also relies on corporate sponsors to fund its extravagant Swiss soiree party every year. So for many financially strapped embassies where governments back home won't justify these kinds of expenses in an era of austerity, these partnerships with local museums and corporations are the backbone of a lot of embassy outreach today. Social media is another emerging avenue that embassies take advantage of to spread their message. I think embassies, like my own profession of journalism, were slow to catch on to this new digital world. But that's gradually changing as more and more ambassadors embrace Twitter, Facebook, and other platforms. Denmark created the world's first tech ambassador, whose sole mission is to liaise with the tech giants in Silicon Valley. I think embassies now realize that a simple post about certain foods or a travel destination can easily go viral. On the flip side, everyone, perhaps with the exception of our president, has to be mindful of the immediacy of the internet and that you can't take big back tweets, which is obviously an important fact for diplomats whose job, after all, is to be diplomatic. And so now you have a lot of groups such as the Informal Digital Diplomacy Coalition, the Italian Embassy's Digital Diplomacy Series, that kind of help officials navigate this new terrain. The Nordic ambassadors even teamed up a while back to host a Twitter town hall to answer questions about their region from Americans across the country. So these are obviously effective ways to use social media. But long before Twitter and Facebook, the diplomatic community was synonymous with fundraising in the city, and I think it's still very much an integral part of the city's social and charity circuit. There's the Ambassador's Ball, which raises funds to fight MS. We ourselves sponsor something called Heart's Delight, which is a week-long just wine extravaganza that actually raises millions of dollars for the American Heart Association and hosts a series of private embassy dinners. But even for much smaller NGOs and charities, embassies are often a lifeline for them. A local singing group called Opera Camerata of Washington is hosting its annual gala at the British Ambassador's residence next week. And that one event is going to be key to its year-long fundraising efforts. The International Student House of DC also just hosted an event at the British residence. And bringing this type of cachet is very important when it comes to attracting donors to a small organization. The Student House event also illustrates how embassies subtly support certain causes, such as international education, at a time when President Trump has proposed dramatically slashing the budgets for international exchange programs. So this gets to the political side of cultural diplomacy. I think no matter what, especially in this town, politics is always in the background of any cultural outreach. We just wrote about how the Saudi embassy hosted an event for Saudi female artists, which of course is part of a campaign to cast the country in a more positive light, given its poor track record on women's rights. There's even been a sort of geopolitical competition playing out on the local art scene. The UAE and Oman are major financial backers of the Middle East Institute, which boasts an expansive arts and culture program. The Qataris also fund their own think tank and cultural initiatives, which I think just goes to show that the competition for influence goes well beyond Capitol Hill and the White House. Politics here is everywhere. When the local DCJCC screened a film touting the courage of Kurdish fighters in Iraq and Syria, it's no coincidence that Israel and Kurdistan have strong relations. Likewise, when Lithuania screens a film about overcoming Soviet oppression, it's a not so subtle dig at Russia's more recent aggression in the region. Even the unveiling recently of a statue outside the Chilean embassy honoring Orlando Lettier a human rights icon who was actually assassinated in the streets of Washington by the Pinochet regime, can be viewed as a veiled rebuke of the downrating of human rights under the Trump administration. So I think cultural diplomacy will always be a way for countries with tense bilateral relations to emphasize the positive. I don't necessarily think this glosses over fundamental differences in policies. Those will always still be there. But it can certainly soften a country's image and lead to at least some tentative contacts among adversaries. In May, the Kennedy Center is holding a massive festival on Cuban art, which will be interesting to see given Cuba's political transition in April and the strained relations under the new administration. The Chinese embassy, which tends to be wary of holding too many public events, teamed up with the Meridian Center to host a Lunar New Year celebration. And last year, Ivanka Trump attended along with her Mandarin-speaking daughter. So obviously that generated a ton of positive press for both Beijing and the Trumps. But this type of interaction is not always friendly and does come with caveats. Jared Kushner, for instance, has been criticized for being too close to the Chinese ambassador, so his presence at their events certainly raises eyebrows. I've also personally noticed that cultural events have become much more political and emotionally personal. We did a story last year on how local artists, many working with embassy-affiliated groups, have staged very blunt exhibitions exposing the atrocities of Syria's civil war, America's reluctance to intervene in the conflict, and just the general worldwide neglect of refugees. So culture can certainly be a subtle but powerful way for nations to convey both their values and their disagreements with the U.S. The French embassy, for instance, recently held a series of discussions on the cost of doing nothing to fight climate change, and how climate change can in fact generate job growth, which is the complete opposite of the argument that President Trump has long made. Likewise, the Swedish embassy defends its core values through its cultural programming. Of course, it touts its technological innovations and business ties, but it also highlights its pioneering stances on global issues like environmental sustainability, migration, and women's rights such as the Me Too movement. Positions that oftentimes stand in stark contrast to the current administration, even though they want to maintain friendly ties with it. So, I think this blurring of lines between politics and culture is ultimately a healthy evolution, because it's going to spark a much needed debate at a time when, ironically, even though we live in such an interconnected, globalized world, many of us are more divided than ever. So I hope the examples I've given here today illustrate not only the depth of cultural diplomacy here in DC, but also how these events can alter people's perception of a country, which in turn I hope demonstrates the enduring importance of soft power at a time when all we seem to be hearing about is hard power. So on that note, if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
Thank you.
Mhm.
That was awesome.
Mhm.
My question is relating to trends using social media for invitations
Mhm.
and the access for really the general public outside of the diplomatic community, and how that's enhancing our stewarding of international relations in Washington.
Mhm. Well, I think it's the issue is twofold. In terms of people who are already on invite lists, I was talking to the British social secretary who's been here for well over 25 years. So I mean, she's an institution of knowledge unto herself, and she was talking about how times have just generally changed. There's no more snail mail. Everything's paperless post. We all know we RSVP at the last minute. So logistically, it's made hosting events difficult. Now for, I don't want to say outsiders, but say, you don't have an obvious connection to the British embassy or what have you. I think public diplomacy has opened up that avenue, and people ask me all the time, how do I get an invite to go to the Embassy of Argentina? It really starts with having a focus of a country that interests you, Portugal, Spain, what have you. And now because embassies, are digitally moving into the 21st century, most have up-to-date websites and listservs. Really all it takes is signing up for that particular embassy. Spain, for instance, has really evolved and actually turned their former ambassador's residence into a cultural center. So you have you just sign up to get their email alerts, and oftentimes they're really happy to have the public come out to these cultural events, because generally a lot of these cultural events still don't always get a ton of press. The Washington Post is not going to, in the middle of a crisis, run out to a small art exhibition. So when embassies can get the public to come, they're more than happy to do that. And I always just say, pick and choose the country that interests you. Make sure you follow them, let them know. You can even send them an email, I'm interested in your cultural events. And then from there, once you go, you mingle with the people who come, and from there it's kind of an organic process where you become more involved with that particular embassy.
Well, I notice more and more the embassies are using Eventbrite, and
Yes.
people can, anybody,
Yes.
depending on the
Yeah.
embassy, and some
Yeah.
are ticketed events and some
Right.
aren't, but I personally think that that's so robust in being able to really steward
Yes.
relations at the very local level.
Yes.
For all of these
Mm-hmm.
embassies.
No, I mean it's really getting there, and you see like the Austrian Cultural Forum, part of the embassy. I mean they've been doing events for years, but again they only just not even quite 2 years ago really got into Eventbrite, which cuts down on their administrative costs. And again, some of the events are free, some for a fairly nominal amount. And once you get into that, you become, as an embassy, is very savvy, because you sort of become part of the digital world. Word spreads about your events. So I mean that is really one of the biggest evolutions that I've seen. Is there've always been cultural events, but the public just hasn't always been aware of them, and that's still not completely changed, but it's definitely thanks to things like Eventbrite and reaching out online, dramatically changing. Mm-hmm.
How Washington Diplomat, what is Washington Diplomat's main object? Just promote the diplomats and
Mm-hmm.
embassies,
Mm-hmm.
or somehow can be, like you mentioned, Israel and Kurdish, but there are many. Tibetan have a problem with China.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any space, Washington Diplomat, for the cultural diplomacy, like food diplomacy? My wife do the food diplomacy, kind
Mhm.
of the food, like you mentioned, is a very powerful tool,
Mhm.
mind and soul, this kind of.
Yeah, I mean, we really do a range of stories. The newspaper is, obviously we focus on hard news, so there's a different ambassador on the cover each month, usually tied to some news development that's taking place in the world. But I've always described our newspaper as this unique hybrid of whereas we're a very local grassroots community newspaper. It just so happens that this community focuses on the entire world. So it's a mix of both, and I think that's where the culture section really plays a key role in highlighting what local embassies do. We also have an online newsletter called The Pouch. And again, this is a good way for us to highlight if, say, the Chileans are hosting a food event or something like along those lines. That would be a classic example of, an event that we cover. So, I mean, our topics are broad, but we always kind of put a priority on embassy-related events and news and developments, just because that's really, we try and make that our niche audience. But, in terms of food diplomacy, we've written, numerous stories over the years. State Department, I remember, this was a while back under Obama, they did a culinary diplomacy initiative. I'm not sure if they still do it, but they hosted embassy chefs and kind of famous celebrity chefs at Blair House, and it was, it's off the record, but it was all talking about just how the promotion of American food abroad can strengthen relations. And so, we covered that. We did a story on that. So yeah, I mean, we really cover a wide range of things, but we always kind of try to remember our core audience, which is embassies.
How do you reach out with your programs? Is it to your readers?
Yes.
Or to the public in general? How can you control this?
Sure. I mean, like everyone, we've got a website, so you can, for instance, just sign up for our updates. And same thing, just like many embassies, we kind of reach out to a combination. We obviously have a list of our readers and embassies and diplomats who follow us. So obviously they'll receive information, but then kind of the other half is just the general public who happens to have an interest, whether it's subscribers or what have you. And same thing, just as I said, in terms of becoming more involved in particular embassies. Oftentimes it's as simple as going to their website, putting your email in, and getting updates from them, and eventually that will get you on lists. And it's very much the same thing with us.
Could you tell please, why is the United States not so concerned about propagating its own cultural centers? We had one cultural center in Stockholm. They closed it down and it's gone.
Yeah.
And nothing replaced it.
Right.
So if you really want to discuss an American play or artist or so, it never takes place in any American space. It always takes place in a Swedish space. Why is this neglect, or it is confidence that we are so big, you want to know about us, you can reach this and that?
I mean, I think it's a complicated answer because it's a mix of reasons. I certainly think confidence is one, where you just assume we're to many, at least to Americans, the most important country in the world, so we don't necessarily need to advertise ourselves in that manner. I mean, I also think it goes back to very much this history, at least compared to European countries, where the government doesn't necessarily have a role in those kinds of things. The government doesn't have a role in tourism promotion. This is much more of a private sector thing. So, if you notice, a lot of U.S. embassies abroad, when they do, like the Art in Embassies program is a program where famous artists, donate their works to embassies. This is all privately run. It's through donors. It's through corporate giving, and I think that somewhat goes back to this tradition where the U.S. is much more built on a private sector model versus Europe, which has the public sector more involved in a lot of areas. And obviously, I mean, there's no sugarcoating with this current administration. Priorities are much more limited. It's obvious there's just a lot of confusion of what's going on, what the priorities are. I also think, as I mentioned, it's a transatlantic trend where people are looking much more inward. So, promoting your country abroad is simply not a priority for the current administration, and I don't think it's a priority for a large segment of the American population that are much more concerned with domestic issues. And that's not necessarily unique to the U.S. So I think it's a tough question. I really think it's just a lot of factors at play why other countries tend to pay more attention to that, whereas it's not so much of a priority here. Anyone else? I'll let you get going. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time.